briefly up to 10 minutes on the topic. That is, how does the Hong Kong security law and the decoupling from China impact Taiwan? Then Winnie King, and then Malte Kaeding. And during this time, I invite everybody to write down the questions we have. And as I have some technical problems, if I have problems to read the things on my mobile phone, I would ask Diane maybe then to help a little bit to read the questions. But at the moment, it seems fine. Yes, now I would like to invite Professor Sandschneider, but I mentioned briefly, there are many people, and it's just one person I especially would like to welcome. It's Professor Xie, the representative of Taiwan in the Federal Republic of Germany, who joined this meeting today. Thanks, Professor Xie. Professor Sandschneider.
All right, Jens. Thank you so much. First of all, welcome to all of you in this wonderful format we all have to get used to in these pretty complicated times. 10 or 15 years ago, we would all perhaps have met in one place in the world, traveling for hours and days. And now it's this format. And Jens reminded me, of course, of the many years in which we have been working together sometimes and sometimes less. While you were in Taiwan, we didn't. And now we are taking it up again. So it's all coming back. And let me start with a memory of my own. You mentioned my time at the German Council on Foreign Relations. And as Professor Xie knows, Deutsche Gesellschaft für Auswärtige Politik in Taiwanese ears, that almost sounds like the Foreign Office, which it is not. It is a private institution. But I had the great honor to meet a person you all know. She is president of Taiwan these days, Professor Tsai Ing-wen. I had met her many years ago while she was still in the law and university business, and she came to visit Germany a few months ahead of her first running for office. And we spent about 2 hours in my office in Berlin talking about the situation of Taiwan then. And my advice to her was, and this leads to the topic of today's conference, don't shake the present status quo. It's the best you can get. You won't possibly be able, without any major international upheavals, to reach independence. Nor will you be economically independent from Taiwan. But now things have changed for a number of reasons. First of all, the first reason, Jens Damm mentioned it briefly, nothing is growing faster in China these days than national confidence. And the way President Xi Jinping is implementing this growing self-confidence in pushing ahead China's global positioning against the United States. It's also felt in Europe. And of course, Taiwan would be the big remaining issue of national sovereignty, which he would like perhaps to solve, to finally compare himself to Deng Xiaoping and the situation in Hong Kong. Now, since you asked about the impact of the security law of Hong Kong, well, one thing is now for sure. This model of one country, two systems is dead, full stop. I cannot imagine that anyone in Taiwan still believes in this model ever to work. So when Deng Xiaoping obviously wanted to have a symbolic element to win back Taiwan, the Brits wanted to get out without losing their face. And well, China wanted to have at least a 50 years time in between before finally taking sovereignty over Hong Kong. This is happening faster than possible. And only in the most ideal of all worlds could you expect that the present government of China would wait till 50 years are over and then from one day to the next take over Hong Kong and implement their sovereignty over Hong Kong. This is a process which is going on. And let me just add, that's certainly of discussion, that some of Western approaches, especially comments made about the impact of the security law, I feel are pretty much hypocritical, because Hong Kong never was a democracy Western style, full stop. Hong Kong was a crown colony, and let me remind all of us that back in the 1960s, there were similar demonstrations as we have seen them over the last month against British colonial rule. And it was only due to Chris Patten, when it was clear that Hong Kong would have to be handed back, that the Brits started to introduce minor democratic reforms. But people in Hong Kong, of course, feel the pressure of a People's Republic of China finally taking sovereignty within the next years to come. But frankly, most of our politicians don't know much about the history of Hong Kong. They are not really concerned about the future of Hong Kong. They're making big statements, mainly aimed at criticizing China. But when it comes to really helping people in Hong Kong, I have my doubts whether anyone from Washington to Berlin to Brussels to anywhere else in the world is really willing to do something. So the impact of the security law, in my perspective, is pretty simply ending this dream, this conceptualization of one country, two systems for good. And that leads, to, of course, to the big issue, what about the security and the status of Taiwan? Again, I repeat my absolute conviction that the status quo is perhaps the best Taiwan and the people in Taiwan can get for the time being. We all do realize, of course, the increasing hostility in speeches coming out of Beijing. And there is, in my perspective, the biggest risk for Taiwan's security, a clash between the United States and China in the South China Sea over minor incidents which could happen anytime, which might lead under this present American administration, incalculable as it is, to a major conflict impacting also Taiwan. Before getting too long, let me just make a very short remark on the issue of decoupling. That is, for Taiwan, a challenge as big as it is, for example, for German companies. Our German companies also have to make choices. And if you work with banks involved in doing business with China and you run the risk of being sanctioned by the United States, what are you going to do if you are a company leader in southern Germany specializing both on the American market and on the Chinese market? And in Taiwan, as you all know, decoupling from China and reducing the dependency of China's economy has been a big issue. But the shortest version of all is easier said than done. You might realize that being interdependent with a country like China is creating certain challenges, difficulties, even risks. But getting rid of these dependencies is nothing you do from one day to the next. What we can see is that there are a few attempts to bring out production facilities from the Chinese mainland, for example, not only back to Taiwan, but also to other countries in Southeast Asia. The new southward bound policy of the Taiwanese president is just one indication of these attempts, but that will take years, and it will not happen from one day to the next. It is, economically speaking, the biggest challenge for Taiwan's economy, as it is for ours. In terms of security policy, I once again repeat, the status quo is the best Taiwan can get. And the big invisible third party always is, of course, the United States. Very much will depend on the overall situation in East Asia across the Pacific on November 3rd, when we all know, perhaps or not, whether the next president of the United States will be Donald Trump or Joe Biden. Jens, thank you so much for the time being. I hope I didn't anger you too much.
Yeah, thank you very much. If you have any questions, write them in the chat. And now to the next speaker, to Winnie.
Thank you, Jens. Okay. I think when we talk about the idea of the Hong Kong security law decoupling from China, a lot of it is they're very significant and they're very large issues, but a lot of it is quite speculative, right? I mean, we know that the Hong Kong security law, like Professor Sandschneider has pointed out, it's quite a definitive crystal ball in terms of regarding how the People's Republic of China will expect to behave should reunification happen between Taiwan and China. Okay, but that it's very clear that the one country, two systems, and I agree with the professor, is a bit kaput. Okay, And that's not least because Taiwan, unlike Hong Kong, has its own very clear identity and its own very clear system with regards to its own domestic political historical culture, and presents far more barriers because it has its own very established pre-existing party system and democracy, and a very strong embrace of pluralism. Okay, so I think from my perspective, because of my interest in cross-strait relations from socioeconomic perspective and political economy, I think more than looking at the speculative, I think it's more useful to look at what actually is. Okay. And so I have basically 2 key points and 2 key foci, which I think are quite significant, that if we have time, we could discuss in Q&A. Okay. I think the first thing we need to, in terms of points, is we need to discuss what do we mean by decoupling from China. Okay. And as Professor Sandschneider pointed out, it's very, very complex. It isn't just a matter of the fact that we're intertwined in terms of the nature of trading and manufacturing and supply chains, level of bilateral investments and holding of debt, if we're talking about America and China. There's also the idea of the substantive decoupling would represent on the international level at multilateral institutions, right? If we're talking specifically about Sino-US relations, then we're also looking at the idea that decoupling from China also means that there's a significant abdication of responsibility and inability to keep China in check, okay? Because you're basically distancing yourself from it, okay? And so we know this itself will not only not be a smooth journey, but it will be a very inconsistent one, okay? The second part also means the second foci is that the US decoupling from China does not automatically mean that Taiwan's decoupling from China, okay? And by this, I mean that China's interest in Taiwan has not changed. It remains the same. And in fact, because of the actions of the Trump administration in the South China Sea, as well as across the Taiwan Straits, because of its efforts to kind of contain China in the area of Huawei and 5G and innovation, and also we're talking about Chinese investment in other American allies' economies, then Taiwan becomes more coveted if we're talking about the Chinese party states' legitimacy and authority. Okay, so the Hong Kong security law and the severity of this is the perfect example of how China may respond. Okay, with regards to the foci, I think we need to think about. With regards to the kind of 2 areas where I think we could focus is how Taiwan could take advantage of this effort by America to promote at least some form of decoupling from China and how it can manage it. Okay, and I think what Taiwan needs to be aware of is what it represents for Taiwan and how realistic Taiwan needs to be with regards to securing its current situation. I absolutely agree with Professor Sandschneider that the status quo is the ideal situation for Taiwan. We know what will happen if Taiwan tries to go independent. We know what will happen. The Hong Kong case is a perfect example of what would happen if we try to reunify. And in actual fact, I think it would be worse for Taiwan. Okay, but I think we need to recognize that while Taiwan is trying to maneuver its position in the current situation, the substantive level and substantive nature of Sino-US relations has not changed. Okay? They are inherently competitors. What Trump has done is lifted the mask or lifted the veil of how America is engaging with China. Whether under Obama you want to use military forms and military bases to contain China, what Trump is doing is using economic tools instead. Okay? And he's being quite successful with it. But we also need to remember that the Trump administration is very inconsistent in how it engages with China. And therefore, we cannot always rely on what Trump is saying when we, Taiwan, are trying to engage with China. Okay, so when we're thinking about that, we need to see this as an opportunity to build up ties, relations, advisory strategic alliances with traditional democracies as well as with allies. Okay, so Germany is a perfect example. While Germany is not quite vocal on where they're coming out with regards to Huawei and 5G, as well as with regards to Trump's position on China, Germany is also a friend of Taiwan. So how do we work with either these allies or even other developing economies in the space, the growing space that we currently have? This would mean promoting Taiwan's development experience, promoting Taiwan's experience with regards to a peaceful transition to a democracy, how Taiwan knows China and how it could teach other economies or other countries how to engage and understand China. That puts Taiwan in a very coveted and strategic beneficial position. Okay. The other side is that there's also real risks, because irrespective of who wins in November, America, if it pushes China too far, well, it will have grave consequences for Taiwan. Okay. And we need to remember that America is quite a right-leaning country. Okay. So whether or not we have Trump in power, we have Biden in power, the Democratic response to Trump's China policy has actually been they've been quite on board with it. Okay, so whether or not we're going to see Biden, should he win, kind of claw back things, I don't think you'll see a lot of that. In actual fact, what we saw was the Biden campaign coming out and saying and scolding China about the oppression of the Uyghur minority, which is something that Trump hasn't done. So moving on from economics, now Biden's bringing in human rights, which we know China's not particularly happy about. So it will cause more tension. Okay. And so if we jump into bed with America wholeheartedly, we want to be careful not to trade a dependency with China for a dependency with America. What, at least from my perspective, what I'd like Taiwan to be like, you know what, how can we stand on our own 2 feet as best as we can? And basically balance the two who are not getting along to our advantage. Okay. So in this, it requires a really clear affirmation of a strategy that the Taiwanese government will establish in terms of how Taiwan can minimize risk and minimize instability, but maximize the benefits. So that in terms of China, it's long-term goals. Yeah. How extensively do we want to engage with China? How can we diversify our economy to not be fully dependent upon China? And when it comes to America, it's short-term to medium-term goals, because we need to see who's in power, which party is going to actually come into play, and what their priorities will be when it comes to China and ultimately for Taiwan. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Winnie, very much. And before we go to Malte, maybe we can keep one question. I just came up. I think this short and long time is very interesting, because I see so many people and friends in Taiwan who at the moment really see this short time. Isn't it now the time that we got the support of the United States? And I was also reading in the New York Times, it's only a few days ago, US tries to bolster Taiwan's status short of recognizing sovereignty. There seems to be a little bit, I think we had it years ago under Li Denghui, when he said there was a short period, they could have declared independence and then everything would be fine now. Isn't by some Taiwanese at the moment this feeling there in the moment? And maybe we can talk about this a little bit later. I just was thinking about, because both you and Eberhard Sandschneider mentioned this. But now let's go to the...
Can I just say one thing that might speak to that is, what we're basically seeing there is we're allowing Taiwan to be a political ping pong ball for the major players in the international system. And that's I mean, I'm sounding very nationalistic here, but we have very clear national interests. We just need to stand by them and not view it purely and only through the tunnel lens of China.
Okay, yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, Malte.
Thank you very much, Jens. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this event today. And I would like to make 2 main points today. So the first one is a more conceptual point about Hong Kong-China relations, that I think offers a different perspective on the national security law, which is also of direct relevance for Taiwan. And if we still have time, I would like to make a second point with some more policy suggestions regarding political refugees from Hong Kong to Taiwan. So the first point is that I argue that the national security law, the way it was passed and it's implemented at the moment, shows Beijing's action actually driven by fear. So this is a little bit a different argument from Professor Sandschneider. I argue that the regime in Beijing is rules, of course, by fear, but is also driven by fear. So it uses fear, of course, to intimidate Hong Kongers. In the crackdown of the anti-extradition protests, for example, we saw these wide-ranging arrests in Hong Kong or arrest warrants for individuals active overseas recently. So this, of course, caters to the domestic Chinese audience. It shows the regime is tough on these so-called separatists colluding with foreign forces. My analysis is that Beijing is driven by the fear of cracks in its own ruling elite, fear of economic downturn, and fear of growing dissatisfaction in its own population. So that's why we see this overreaction on the part of Beijing in Hong Kong. So maybe you remember that we had these disqualifications of opposition candidates for the Legislative Council elections, which were then followed just a couple of days later by the entire elections being postponed. So I believe that this shows that China is very, very much concerned about, or can only accept complete control over the outcome of the elections. So something like last year with the district council elections cannot happen again. And Xi Jinping, of course, has to be very tough on Hong Kong. I would say that Beijing has been very much surprised about the anti-extradition movement last year. It does fear most the protesters' radical tactics, but also the attitudes. Yeah. So when we look at the protest repertoire, including the main slogan, actually, this has been inspired by these so-called localist movement. And I think localism is arguably the most important development in Hong Kong since 1997 for three reasons. First of all, it fundamentally questions the status quo in Hong Kong-China relations, including calls for Hong Kong independence. Secondly, it promotes direct action. It accepts violence. And thirdly, it includes these early ideas of self-sacrifice. So maybe you remember that in 2016, after the successes of localists in elections, Beijing or the Hong Kong government went back and key leaders were driven into bankruptcy, exile, or sentenced to very long prison terms. And this is something which I think inspired a lot of young people at the time, that for the first time, Hong Kong politicians or leaders will come out, do something for Hong Kong, and take the very high prices on an individual level for this. And my analysis shows is that this idea of self-sacrifice has been transformed and radicalized in the anti-extradition movement last year into this idea of what we call burnism, or mutual destruction. So I burn and you have to burn with me. So this identifies that many mainland Chinese and cadres, businessmen, even middle-class families use Hong Kong for their own private security. So getting another passport, getting their financial assets overseas because of the permanent insecurity and uncertainties in the Chinese system. So at the heart of burnism is actually then the rejection of the CCP's instrumental approach towards Hong Kong's liberal system. So the idea of mutual destruction therefore transforms Hong Kong's fears of authoritarian erosion into a concrete fear for the Chinese elite. And I think we shouldn't underestimate this. Yeah. And this is created by, first of all, establishing an unpredictable economic and political situation in Hong Kong through the protests. And secondly, by denying Hong Kong a safe haven through the international sanctions the movement has triggered. We have to remember that there was very little reaction by China when it was criticized for the human rights abuses in Xinjiang. But once Hong Kong was targeted, Beijing immediately went ahead and implemented a national security law, which has this extra territorial scope, and we can argue that even legalizes hostage diplomacy. So I think this overreaction by Beijing, I think, confirms the fear by China of losing control over Hong Kong. The second point I want to make very briefly is regarding how Taiwan can help Hong Kong during these dark times. And I think it has already done so by providing these new hope to this new generation by saying, okay, you can come over, you can get refugees here. I want to argue that here a very well-prepared scheme to integrate Hong Kong refugees into Taiwanese society would be beneficial for Taiwan. It's actually needed. We have to, or Taiwan has to realize these challenges, and it has to be willing to deal with this in a proactive manner. And I think Taiwan might consider learning from the experience of European countries over the past years with refugee situations. So I would argue that Taiwan should consider setting up a framework of political refugees, which require three elements. First of all, the Taiwan government and Taiwan society must recognize the cultural differences and different experience of Hong Kong refugees. So the integration program has to address that a lot of these refugees are severely traumatized. They're the young people who have been through a very, very tough time. So their mental well-being should be at one cornerstone of this framework. Secondly, there might be potential pressures on the Taiwanese job market, especially for a lot of young people coming over. So steering the Hong Kongers into the desired work areas, desired geographic areas, I think it's very important that there's a concrete strategy there. President Tsai has mentioned that Taiwan wants to develop as an international financial system. So I think that's something which has to be done very professional and with a lot of expertise and manpower to steer these in the right directions. And the final point would be then to run a refugee or asylum application system, you require this significant manpower and experience, because I assume that these refugees will be assessed on a case-by-case basis. So to guarantee the eligibility and minimize the risk of hostile forces or opportunities. So I think that's something, this proactive scheme by Taiwan is something to consider for the refugees from Taiwan, from Hong Kong. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I can see we have the first question, but as I'm the moderator, I've got when you talked about overreacting of Beijing with regard to Hong Kong, didn't Beijing realize that this overreacting, what Professor Sandschneider mentioned at the beginning, would definitely be the end of one country, two systems? So maybe the question is, didn't Beijing also consider what this reaction would mean for Taiwan in a way? Because now it seems it's really, I cannot really believe this. And the second thing, of course, is people are talking about, is it risky Taiwan to accept refugees from Hong Kong? Because basically it is even more going in the direction, it will be the other China, the democratic part, and going against Beijing. Okay, that is one of my questions, but I'm going to read also the two other questions, and then I think all of the speakers are free to answer. So the first from Arthur Quayle, a question for Winnie. If Taiwan is looking for more consistent democratic partners, is Japan not the strongest, closest, and most closely aligned nation for them to look to? Have we seen closer cooperation between the two with regards to Hong Kong? That was the first question. And then, welcome, Mingye. From officially, Mingye is now the representative of the International Journal of Taiwan Studies. Question for Winnie: what cards may Taiwan play to stop being played as a political ping-pong ball between the US and China? Yes, and maybe because Winnie was asked first, so Winnie first, and then the two other speakers.
Okay. So I have just a really quick comment to say to Malte, and then I can respond to the questions if you don't mind. I think the point about Beijing's quick response, the protests in Hong Kong began in March 2019. The national security law came out in July 2020. The protests were going on for over a year. Okay, so I mean, if we even look at what happened with America's response to the Black Lives Matter movement, China did not react quickly, and China was actually quite measured in how it reacted. Okay, I am not in any way saying that what happened was okay, but I'm saying we need to see it for what it really for the big picture. Okay, there's also another thing that we need to take into account is that if you look at the very significant, I would say, most appalling part of the national security law, it's that part where it says anyone who speaks out against China, whether they're in Hong Kong or China or abroad, which is just shocking. Okay, and then you wonder where that comes from, and a big part of it has to do with the fact that American and UK political elites and representatives went to Hong Kong specifically to agitate. Okay, and you can look as to whether or not I'm using the right word for agitate, and if you look at what they did, yeah, they agitated. There's actually hard evidence to show that the CIA was there as well. Okay, and putting the CIA aside, but if you look at how China reacted to Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, and Tom Cotton, who are the most outspoken American Republicans when they were in Hong Kong, that's when China upped the game. They went in November. That's 8 months after the protests started. Okay, there were efforts by China to try and figure some stuff out. Obviously, that wasn't going to happen. But the target isn't just Hong Kong and the Hong Kong citizens. The target is to tell the international system, hands off. Now, I'm not saying that it was a good idea. I actually far from it. I'm not making any conclusions about whether or not it was the right decision. I don't. Well, actually, I have. I don't agree with it. But it wasn't coming out of nowhere. Okay. Okay. So as to so I'll begin with Mingye's question because it's the easiest to answer. What political cards may Taiwan play to stop being played as a ping pong ball between the U.S. and China? What it needs to do is it needs to develop a relationship and an identity separate from the U.S. and China. Okay, it will always be put between the two. Okay, but if Taiwan can actually establish some form of identity and economy and industry and strengths independent of being a political or ideological tool for these two economies and these two countries, that would help. So for instance, the whole idea that I mentioned earlier about Taiwan's experiences for economic development, for political transition, I've worked with some people and written a policy piece for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Economic Affairs with regards to how Taiwan could move into Africa more in a very benign, very functional, somewhat development aid oriented. And this is in the areas of healthcare, in the areas of shipment, some form of infrastructure, education, environmental, green policy, that kind of stuff. Those are the kind of things that are quite benign. The Chinese would not get upset about that. Okay, and it makes it so that we can see Taiwan in the international stage as something more than just something that America and the U.S., America and China can play with. Okay. And then the question that Arthur had with regards to Japan. Japan is a very strong ally for Taiwan, but Japan also comes with a lot of baggage. Okay, it's very strong ties to America. It's the military alliance that they have, Japan's own efforts to reform their constitution. When it comes to Hong Kong, I haven't been following the Hong Kong situation as closely as Malte has, but from what I've seen, there hasn't been any coordinated efforts. I think because they have very different approaches when it comes to immigration and refugee status. Although they have spoken out as being amenable to Hong Kong citizens going to their respective countries. So in terms of coordination, I haven't seen that. But you have to remember that when Taiwan engages with Japan, China gets mad. So that also is a way that Taiwan needs to kind of walk softly. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, I would suggest that Eberhard can answer to any questions raised or also comments to the other two speakers.
I would like to make a short remark on Malte's introduction concerning the fear of Beijing to lose control over Hong Kong, and then turn to the most important core aspect, as it turns out to me, that we have to discuss it. That is the role of China in dealing with Taiwan. Malte, first of all, I could perhaps subscribe to your thesis that Beijing is driven by fear. It is a matter of perspective, in my view. I'm saying the same as you try to say, but I'm using different words. Beijing is concerned about political stability and sovereignty. That's a different way of looking at the same issue. Call it fear or not fear, well, it's up to you. In the end, it is a major concern for Beijing in the case of Hong Kong, in the case of Tibet, in the case of Xinjiang, potentially also in the case of Taiwan, if you want, that they may lose political control, they may lose stability, they may lose the control of sovereignty, and that has always been one of the core strategic issues of the Chinese Communist Party ever since 1949, and certainly since the modernization policies began. So it is a matter of perspective. If you say they are driven by fear, it sounds very negative. If I say they are driven by political stability, that sounds very normal in the international comparison. So you make your choice and you're getting a different story. And here comes the core issue as I see it. Taiwan as a ping pong ball, or Roger Huang, if I read correctly, is having doubts about the status quo. Well, what could Taiwan do? This is one of the core issues, the 800-pound gorilla question for the last decades already. What could Taiwan do towards the World Health Organization, towards the United Nations? The answer is nothing. The tragedy of Taiwan is that it is a functioning democracy with a state structure, with a defined area, with a booming economy, lacking one core aspect to be treated as an independent state, and that is international recognition. And that combines the question whether Japan is a reliable partner, or the United States, or anyone in Europe. Is anyone around there who is willing to accept Taiwan's declaration of independence in case it comes, when pressure from Beijing will rise from one second to the next on the country, on the actor, economically, perhaps even politically? And that is the major risk. To that extent, I understand what Roger Huang tries to tell me. Of course, the growing international influence and impact of China is working definitely against the international status of Taiwan. The HWO is a classical example for that. Taiwan can move internationally only as long as the PRC is tolerating these moves. And that is what I just described it as the tragedy of Taiwan, which makes it extremely difficult to come up with a policy in the perspective of Taiwan's government, which allows for anything but reacting to what Beijing is allowing Taiwan to do or not. That is something I don't see will change for the years ahead. The big risk is, will it get worse? So let's hope that it will stay the same. That is what I mean by status quo. This status quo is changing, but as long as it is, as Taiwan is able to maintain it, the status of the island may at least economically and in terms of security stay as it is.
Malte.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just some two quick remarks in response to Winnie and Professor Sandschneider. First of all, regarding the national security law, so I agree with you that it wasn't, my main point was, and I think I didn't mention it in terms of that it was quickly introduced, but the main point was an overreaction. The scope of it is an overreaction, and the things that followed after. So the example was the Legislative Council election. I'm also not 100% convinced by the idea that this was targeting agitators in Hong Kong. I think it's much more targeted towards curbing the international solidarity. So you have seen a lot of Hong Kong people, activists moving overseas to Canada, US, Europe, and trying to mobilize parliamentarians and governments, relatively successful actually there. So everything of this is of course illegal now. So that's one point. The other point, I think it's a very good point Professor Sandschneider mentioned, that we're talking about a similar thing, maybe the same thing. My point is that using fear, the term, gives agency back to Hong Kong. And that's, I think it's really, really important in this whole debate, that Hong Kong and Taiwan have their own agency. They can do things. They're not the ping pong elements between the US and China. So the point I'm trying to make regarding fear was this idea of Burnism, right? That you, as Hong Kongers, are prepared to sacrifice everything, to sacrifice your future, your personal future, the future of Hong Kong, to target the Chinese authorities or the elites, to bring back fear to them, that they can't use Hong Kong as an offshore account, so to speak. You all know that how important Hong Kong is still for China. So I think that gives agency to the movement. It gives agency to Hong Kong. And I think it's the same way we can look at Taiwan. I'm not saying that they should start a movement and start things in a similar way. My point is that there's a lot of flexibility in terms of NGOs, different types of diplomacy that can be applied. So we all know the successes of the mass diplomacy. Now COVID-19 shows a very positive side of Taiwan. So I think Winnie's idea of engaging with Africa is brilliant, yeah. And we can see things like this already in with the Go South policies, having a long-term. It's very, very slow, but you show a different face compared to China. We have to acknowledge that countries in the south of Asia will always balance themselves between China and the US, between China and Taiwan. That's just in their nature. But Taiwan can use these more softer approaches to guarantee its long-term viability.
Thank you. I just have a look, and I think you started already to talk about the question of Roger Fong. What does it mean, the status quo, tired and outdated? I'm not going to read everything. I think you can see this at the moment. And maybe there's one new thing here, the economic and military capacity of the People's Republic of China and People's Liberation Army. How strong is this? Does this really play a role? Maybe that is one of the questions you could answer. And then we have Anthony Lee. As Taiwan, under the leadership of President Tsai, tends to lean toward the US foreign policy under Trump and thus decouple from China culturally, economically, and politically, given the implementation of the national security law in Hong Kong and its indication of the red line of the PRC regarding secession. What do you think the strategies PRC still have with regards to drifting away Taiwan, absent of an outright invasion? How these strategies might affect Taiwan? Thank you. Yes, I think that is also a very, very interesting question. I know you have to foresee the future, but when one country, two systems, Hong Kong as a model does not work, and of course the invasion of Taiwan, the military, would be another opportunity, but another threat. But what is in between? So how do you expect the People's Republic of China will deal now with the situation in Taiwan? Whoever. And of course, all the listeners, please ask questions online.
If I may, the People's Republic will continue to use all diplomatic, political, and economic measures it has at hand to reduce Taiwan's influence to a minimum of economic presence in the global world. Whenever it comes to issues connected with statehood, there is no compromise from in Beijing's perspective, and that will certainly continue. But let me come up with one argument which might reduce the concerns about the future of Taiwan a little bit. I'm, as a matter of fact, not really concerned about a military invasion of Taiwan. Why? First of all, if you look at the weapon system and the training levels of Taiwan's army, this is not an easygoing attempt. Secondly, you have to realize that any attempt, and I have been to conferences where scenarios are being debated, what a military invasion could look like, with deepening Taiwan's communication system as a first step, and so on, till a full-scale invasion of the island. But think for a moment, what would it mean, not only for Taiwan's economy, but also the impact on the PRC economy itself, and on the regional economy, and on the world economy? And here comes the connection. Of course, political stability and sovereignty and national unity is a major concern of Beijing, but so is the continuation of economic welfare as a major element of political legitimization of the Chinese Communist Party's claim to rule. And a regional conflict of that extent that would endanger this economic perspective of legitimacy on the Chinese mainland, any government in Beijing who would run this risks would also in tendency at least risk a major destabilization on the mainland itself. That is perhaps indirectly speaking the best guarantee for a status quo continuation as we see it for the time being.
Thank you.
If I can add to that,
Please.
I think, I mean, it kind of links back to one thing that I said in my little spiel, is that we need to be careful about how America we need to watch about how America behaves and corners China. Okay, I absolutely agree. When it comes to the military capacity of China, they're not able to compete with America. And in actual fact, the Chinese have never said that they want to take on America militarily. They know they're not going to win. Okay, but the worst thing that we could find is that when we have this, Anthony talks about this idea of a red line, but I'm going to use it within the context of Taiwan, is that when China feels cornered and there is nothing left, and when it comes to the promotion of its domestic economy, when it comes to, and the idea that economic development is part of the central legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, if you lose that, all you have left is national integrity, sovereignty. Okay, and all you need is one nuke. That's all you need. Sounds horrible, but it's a fact.
Winnie,
Okay?
that is really the worst case scenario you can think of.
Absolutely. And it's not in any way what I want. And what I'm trying to say is that the Americans have shown that they don't understand China. And there is a place for Taiwan to say, listen, you need to understand what you're playing with here, because you're playing with our future. Right? Because China has not yet been in a position since the establishment of the People's Republic of China where it needs to actually properly go to war. It's never been in a position where it's actually had a proper economic recession. If you push it too far, it does not yet have the strategies of how to get itself out of crises. And that's the concern for me. Okay. So I just want to say that there's one question that was missed that came from Ava with regards to the idea of what cross-strait relations, besides cross relations, do you believe that the situation in Hong Kong is how it's impacting domestic politics in Taiwan too, especially considering migration from Hong Kong to Taiwan? And you're talking about domestic politics. I think that's a really important point to make, particularly because Tsai Ing-wen has come out and stated that if Hong Kong refugees are going to come to Taiwan, they want them to come through legal channels. Okay, so there's a process that they want to identify. Okay, and so that basically means you need to control the number of people coming in, because Taiwan traditionally is not particularly open to the idea of immigration. Okay, and domestically, when you have Taiwan is very strong economically in some ways, but quite weak in other ways, and when you have high graduate unemployment, Hong Kong educated, experienced refugees coming in will cause problems within the domestic economy and domestic politics. So you will start to have tensions in that way. Okay, it's whether or not Taiwan's economy is able to absorb them, and whether or not, and what the Taiwan government is going to do to basically compensate for the fact that, well, we need to also create opportunities and secure opportunities for our own citizens and graduates, while these other educated, skilled workers come in as well.
Yeah, thank you. And very briefly, first of all, I would apologize to Eva, but as said, I'm using my mobile phone now, which is a little bit tricky. And before we come to Malte, there's a specific question for you. I would like to ask a question regarding Taiwan-Hong Kong agency by using the Milk Tea Alliance. Hong Kong, Taiwan, Thai, I think even Philippines or something was included, more like Southeast Asia. It's, as far as I know, it's more a digital, online kind of alliance, bringing together so-called pro-democracy, anti-authoritarian rule to wider global audience. So it's now under the national security law, the real protests in Hong Kong are almost gone, and the international forces to interfere are more limited. Plus, with all those self-centered going on, thank you. So I think here the question is really how can protests be organized, also digitally organized? Does it make any, does it help Taiwan in a way when Taiwan also goes south with more or less like democratic activists, or is it even dangerous for Taiwan? And also for the future of the Hong Kong activists, what they are doing now, going digital, going abroad. What is their plan, Malte?
All right, I apologize. They're renovating the offices to make them COVID-19 ready. So they just started apparently. Okay, so hopefully that's not too bad. So that's a really good question. I think this Milk Tea Alliance is, I think has a lot of potential, and we can see still people like Nathan Law, Ray Wong, and these activists who are in exile now continuing this. So maybe you saw the news today that Nathan Law essentially follows around Wang Yi now going through Europe and protesting there. I think it's of course difficult now with the national security law. So you put yourself in potential danger. That's why all these people are exiled, right? So that's something to consider. However, I think solidarity of these movements is very, very important. It's crucial that if there are civil society groups in Taiwan who feel have these connections, that they engage with Hong Kong, Thailand, and so forth. So a couple of years back, Demosisto tried this as well with Japan and Thailand already. So I think there's a precedent of this, and I don't think that is actually dangerous for Taiwan. I'm very much against the idea that just because China might be unhappy, China's always unhappy, that we don't do anything. Because then we just give all the definition of the narrative completely to China, right? They can determine when they're unhappy, when they're happy, when they're unhappy, what they like, what they don't like. So I think civil society solidarity is very important. It's also very important for Hong Kong. So if you look, for example, at the debate about whether or not we should link ourselves with Black Lives Matter because Trump is our savior. A lot of Hong Kong youngsters thought this, but then how does this work? Does police brutality? So a lot of discussions there, but I think there's a lot of potential, as I said, among for solidarity of these movements. The other point I wanted to make was regarding strategy of the CCP. I think Professor Sandschneider and Winnie have already pointed out the main ideas of the unlikelihood of a open conflict, but the target or the strategy of China to make Taiwan economically completely dependent. I think one other thing is that we have to be looking carefully at what is going on the local level. So Wu Jieming has written about this quite well, looking at religious groups and all these different connections. So that's another way of China influencing Taiwan.
Okay, yes, no problem. We heard this. There's some renovation going on. Yeah, thank you, Malte. And I see there are some more questions. Maybe we can collect these questions and then we still have about 20 minutes. So how do you think the Taiwan government would have responded had the speedboat of Hong Kong activists who were heading towards Taiwan before they were intercepted and arrested by China's Marines? Okay. Given then Roger Huang, again, he asked, given the worst case scenario, is the use of nukes to Taiwan consider reactivating and developing nuclear weapons, reactivating the nuclear weapons program? And Philipp O'Reilly to everyone, does Beijing understand Taiwan? Well, that is a very brief question. Yes.
Yes. Do you want to have a brief answer? I have no idea. I have no idea, and towards Taiwan. But understanding Taiwan is a big challenge for any one of us anyway. That's part of the game. Understanding Germany is similarly difficult, or France, or the Brits these days, not to mention our American friends. But on a more serious note, Winnie, in one of her recent remarks, seemed to be willing to invite Taiwan to help Americans to understand China better. That is a big task, Winnie, because it was briefly mentioned, if they presently, while the election campaign there is really gaining speed, in my reading, the only one issue where both parties in the US still have a large amount of agreement is criticizing China. And what is irritating for me is the dramatically ever more aggressive language in the US when it comes to dealing with China, including military options, arguing we better do it now, in 5 years they might be too strong. So the risk of Taiwan, one of the core risks of Taiwan, of course, is a misreading of China in an American perspective. And in my understanding, you don't have to read Graham Allison and Destined for War theories. The Trans-Pacific conflict between the US and China is the defining conflict of the first half, at least, of the 21st century. And Taiwan is almost literally right in the middle of it. So this is also part, of course, of the answer to the nuke question. One nuke is one nuke too much. And the risk of having nukes and using them, these bloody things just don't react to national borders. That's the problem. And whenever one, as we have learned from Chernobyl or from Fukushima, there are no limits for nuclear fallout. No one would wish that to happen anywhere in East Asia, and certainly not over the island of Taiwan.
But isn't there the problem that at least since Nixon, we still had in the American, every time there was a new administration, there was a time in the beginning when the China policy was unclear, there was a lot of human rights, but after some time, the specialists, the experts were asked, and there was a kind of pragmatism, a kind of realpolitik came. And this Trump administration, it seems there is not this kind of expertise coming even after 3.5 years. And that is, of course, which makes, in a way, yes, okay, shortly before an election, it could come again. But it was the whole time. There was not really a very clear strategy of the United States policy towards China.
There actually was. And then this is why I said at the very beginning is that what Trump has done is it's lifted the veil. It's taken off the mask of the actual reality of what America's China policy is. The substantive part of the relationship has remained unchanged. America's initial goal when Nixon established relations was to bring China into the fold, to basically challenge the Soviet Union and turn China. And the neoliberal system in terms of buy into capitalism, buy into globalization, maybe the more you purchase, the more you take on our norms and participate in our multilateral institutions, the more China will become like us. So that was one mechanism to do it through. You couldn't use ideology because that clearly failed, right? So you need to use purchasing power. And what Trump has done is, if you're unhappy with certain things, what you'll do is you'll threaten sanctions or you'll engage in military threats and posturing. What Trump has done is basically said, okay, well, you know what? I'm not particularly keen on the military side initially. So let's focus on the economic side because he's a businessman. He's very, very pragmatic. If you look at who he appointed all the neocons and the hawks from day one, who were all China skeptics. Yeah. And so they were not, if you watch it, it's not a surprising decision. He's actually, and I can't believe I'm saying this in a public forum, there's certain aspects where you can see he's actually can be pretty seen as smart. Okay. But it's the key thing that we're really trying to understand is what does this mean for Taiwan? The idea of saying, well, Taiwan could have a role to play to help America understand is America needs to be needs to be open enough to actually understand that they don't understand China. They can't understand China. They look at China through its own narrow lens that China is like America and China's not like America. And so if Taiwan's going to help America to understand China, which it can do, America needs to accept that it doesn't understand China, which is a bigger hurdle. Okay, going to the point of nuclear weapons, neither China nor America will let Taiwan restart it.
Eberhard or Malte?
Yeah. Just a little anecdote. Back in 1982, when I first came to Taiwan, my Chinese language teacher asked me why I'm going to learn Chinese. And I said, I want to become a China expert. And he looked at me and said, you will never understand China. And when I asked why, he said, you are not Chinese. So that's a challenge for the United States till this very day.
Okay, I just see there is a follow-up question from Aoife. I believe you can say that Tsai Ing-wen exploited the situation in Hong Kong last year to gain consensus and win the 2020 elections. So now I believe the people of Hong Kong expect her to act accordingly. But the migration from Hong Kong to Taiwan seems a controversial issue because of what Winnie said. How can the Tsai administration find a solution to this? Maybe it can also be seen as a provocation to China, as some say. Yes, who wants to answer or give some comments on this provocation issue?
Oh, okay, I'll just say really quick. I mean, I thought Malte would want to because he's the expert in Hong Kong. I would just say when it comes to, there's a lot of different countries who propose to the welcoming of Hong Kong citizens or holders of British overseas passports. We have yet to see any of them really create a consistent, comprehensive policy of how they can come.
Yeah.
And so it's not just Tsai Ing-wen and the idea that she kind of made use of the Hong Kong situation. If she didn't, she would have been silly. She's a politician, and that's what they do. Yeah. But the migration of Hong Kong, how can the Thai administration find a solution to that? Well, the thing is that Taiwan doesn't have a history of welcoming refugees. It doesn't have a system for that. So it would have to create one. I don't know what it will look like.
But I would say in this case, of course, migration from Hong Kong has this political issue, which is different than accepting other refugees, for example. So this is a mixture. There's no refugee policy and official, but of course, could be that Beijing is more angry with Hong Kong activists going to Taiwan than just going to England, for example. That could be another question.
But according to China, both Hong Kong and Taiwan are part of China. So what do you care if you're moving from province to province?
No, since we are, that's true as well. Since we are obviously concentrating on this migration issue, I have a genuine question. What are the quantities? How many people are trying to migrate? We have seen Boris Johnson making big gestures, and finally, after 20 odd years, to invite people from Hong Kong to get a British passport. But how many people really try to do that? How many people are migrating to Taiwan? Are these hundreds of thousands? Are these a few hundred? Or are these a handful of quote unquote dissidents? I would guess that over the next month, this debate about the security law will calm down, and it will become a normal part of legislation in Hong Kong, being accepted by many people living in Hong Kong, while a few who fundamentally disagree will have to find other places in this world to live in. But I'm not sure about the quantities. That's a serious question. Anyone, Malte, do you have any information about how many people try to leave Hong Kong for Taiwan or for Britain or for any other part of the world?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think at the moment it's quite early to say. I think by the end of the year we will know more, because first of all, the new policy for BNO holders will start in January in the UK. So I don't have any official data. All I have is some hearsay from friends or colleagues, but you can see that, of course, aside from the dissidents you mentioned who are afraid for their personal well-being, you can see a lot of relatively a significant number of people who are maybe in their 30s and 40s who are concerned about their children growing up under the new system, because you can see the new education policies being implemented. So I think by the end of the year we might have a better picture. At the moment, it's not a mass movement, but I can tell you in the UK, there's of course already banks and property agents who are catering now to all the expected BNO holders with the big money coming in. I think that's one of the things you pointed out already, that why after so many decades the UK has changed its position on BNO. There are many first of all, Boris Johnson was pushed by backbenchers, but at the same time we have to remember we are still going through Brexit. So having a lot of people with significant spending potential coming from Hong Kong investing in the UK might be actually a good thing. And surveys actually show in the UK that the population, the British, would be very welcome to embrace Hong Kong people coming over. We have to see how this plays out and how many people are coming over. Just briefly on, I completely agree with Winnie that Tsai Ing-wen exploiting the issue. It was an open goal. Remember that Han Kuo-yu went to the liaison office in Hong Kong just a couple of weeks before the movement started. Yeah, so Tsai Ing-wen not mentioning Hong Kong during the election campaign would have been politically not very clever. And we also have to remember that she's following the Hong Kong issue for a long time, since 2012 already. So I'm also not very much concerned about this idea of provocation for China, the refugees. I think it's getting too noisy.
And I just see we have another question which goes a little bit in another direction. We talked about Hong Kong, we talked about China, but Professor Scheer is now asking, Taiwan is now not facing the threat from China alone. Nearly all the bordering states are confronted with the ambition in the South China Sea. And that saves Taiwan. And there's no way back for China because they can't afford losing their face. And this again saves China. So the ambition of China. So basically, yes, it's the South China Sea where, besides what we mentioned, the Huawei, the economic is in Hong Kong. That, of course, is another of the big questions, geopolitical questions. What does this mean for Taiwan? Yeah, thank you, Professor Xia. Who wants to start?
The South China Sea is a difficult issue because I agree with Professor Xie. China will not move back. The claim over this huge sea area will remain. The efforts in building even military posts there are quite obvious. The risk is not only minor conflict, quote unquote, minor conflicts with neighboring countries. Take the Philippines, for example, take Vietnam, also take Taiwan. But the major risk is American FONOPS activities, freedom of navigation operations, which might lead to disaster any time. I just remind you that in November last year, we had an almost encounter of two frigates being 45 meters away from each other. That is at full speed, at high sea, nothing. That is a glimpse of an eye. And it could happen. And this is my greatest concern, that conflicts by coincidence might lead to major military conflict between the United States and China. And that would, of course, also have a direct and possibly pretty negative impact on Taiwan. Taiwan itself can do not very much. And if I'm not all wrong, theoretically at least, Taiwan supports major claims, except their own ones by mainland China, to put it this way, on this part of the world. The other neighboring countries may take a different perspective. But in the end, my guess would be that in 20 years from now, China will have a major control over this part of the South China Sea.
Okay.
Can I just add really quickly? Professor Xie added the point that China's invited the U.S. to involve in South China Sea in this case, and that saves Taiwan again. What do you mean by to become involved? The reason I say this is because China wants stability in the South China Sea. I mean, it's very important for its Belt and Road Initiative. It's very important for the economy and for trading routes and stuff like that. The thing that we need to understand is if China's going to invite U.S. to be involved, we need to know what involved means and to what extent and which USA. So if we have Trump being invited versus Biden being invited, those are two very different things, because Trump sees things in a bubble, and so military is military. He doesn't see all the potential spillover effects and the peripheral impact that it has, whereas I'm hoping, anyways, Biden does. But Biden's not given any real indication about what his China policy would be in the first place. There's not a lot of policy in his campaign. Because the bordering nations welcome USA to push China back. Does that mean, sorry, Jens, but anyway, that's what I wanted to say. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Yes. Yeah. I think. Yeah. Maybe Malte or Eberhard again to this threat by China. Yeah.
Yeah. That is a little bit, with all due respect, that is a little bit wishful thinking. In theory, it's true. China is the towering power in that part of the world, and of course, any other neighboring country feels, well, threatened, quote unquote, by China's growing influence, both economically and politically. And let me say that in between the lines, if you take an outsider's perspective, a neutral perspective, watching events in global affairs going on as they develop geopolitically, what we are seeing in the case of China is a very, very normal process. If you have a country of that size, it's a real big chunk geographically, in terms of population, in terms of economic performance. you shouldn't be too astonished that this country will be able to exert political influence and in the end also military influence. So it is understandable that smaller, quote unquote, still big enough, like countries like Indonesia, for example, but still smaller, they feel threatened, they feel pushed by China sometimes, and they would like to see China being pushed back. But that is exactly the dangerous thing, to take a purely perspective on China's increased role in international affairs. As I said, it is a normal process, and believe it or not, even if you have lots of debates about containing China in the United States, that will never work. How in heaven's name would you contain a country as big as China, as important as China? Someone mentioned Taiwan in Africa a few minutes ago. Go to Africa and ask countries there whether they would be willing to act against China, given the huge impact China has economically in terms of infrastructure building and so on in Africa. So China is not alone out there. It is much too easy to believe that it is still time for a military approach in containing China. That will lead to disaster. And with all due respect, Professor Xie, will not help Taiwan. Taiwan is too close to China still, geographically speaking, not to be involved in such a conflict.
Okay, the time is always over. Please feel free to add some last remarks if you like to. Winnie, anything, final words? If not, yes, I think we have a last question. How to understand China's impact? Oh, but I have to, yeah. Yes, how to understand China's impact is the most important issue for every country's national security. However, every country's sense of risk for China is different. For example, even in East Asia, there are tremendous differences in consciousness about China. So how should we share the knowledge and experience about China's impact and influence each other? And Joyce asked questions to Winnie. I would like to know what you mean by the US not understanding China. Are you talking about the present or the past? There are little disagreement that for a long time, Western countries imagined that China would become like them when its economy opened up. But their policy towards China has changed recently. Do you think they have learned and now understand China? If not, what about China is that you think China is not understood? Big questions.
Yes. If I may, I have a very simple answer. No, understanding has not turned towards the better. But it is an important aspect which I'm mentioning. And it's also part of this 50-year time span for the one country, two systems. Back in 1997, that was in the decade of extreme optimism among all Western countries that democracy and market economy will win the day in the historical conflict, first with communism and then with authoritarianism. And of course, 50 years seemed a pretty long time. And the big hope was, after 50 years, China may have become like us, a little bit more democratic, a little bit more based on Western values. And then it's easy for Hong Kong to join the sovereignty of China. Meanwhile, we have realized that this exactly did not happen. And that is the big frustration for many Western elites who had believed that China is on its way to build middle classes, which will be asking for democratic reforms and transformations. All this is not happening. China is obviously developing an authoritarian model of its own, and that is the big challenge. And that also leads to a lot of frustration. Many of my American colleagues who now criticize China have been teaching China for the last 40 years on what China should do in terms of economic reforms, political reforms, reforms of any kind. And now the level of frustration is unbelievably high because these, excuse me, bloody Chinese just don't do it. They don't do what we advise them to do. And that adds to our frustration. It doesn't add to our understanding of China. That is one of the big challenges. And believe me, speaking to you from Berlin and in a now purely German perspective, that's one of the big problems of German policy towards China. There are very, very few people in our parliament, in our administration, who have a clue of what China is about, not to mention a minimum competence. It's perhaps not only typical for Germany, but that is the challenge of the West. We have to deal with China, whether we know it or not, and we know pretty little about what Beijing is up to, what Beijing is thinking, how Beijing is defining its own strategic interests and political actions. That's our challenge. Keeps us busy. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. There is another question, but time is running out. So let me thank again all the people. Yes, I think that is what Professor Sandschneider, to answer Professor Schier, just said. Yes, Germany, of course, had hoped the same. Economy first, middle class, and now everybody is a little bit, disappointed or just doesn't understand what is going on, because we had our idea how the world will be, and China is not really following this. Taiwan following.
Yeah, but if you look at it, the thing is, though, if you look at it, is what China's population, which has to buy into the democratic model, is seeing is absolute anarchy and populism in a lot of Western European, Eastern European, and countries and America. The 2008 global financial crisis showed the Chinese and the Chinese people that actually capitalism is not the be all and end all. And then under Trump, we're basically seeing how the neoliberal system and democracy actually is not that stable. And so actually, maybe it's not the answer. And so timing wise, it's not, America cannot hold itself up as a beacon right now. And so that causes a lot of problems.
Eberhard.
Well, the final remark to Winnie could only be the torch of the shining city on the hill is not lighting anymore, at least for the time being. It's sad to say, but it also explains, we have been debating China, but if you for 1 second take a transatlantic perspective, that also explains the huge amount of frustration about the development of transatlantic relations. We are blackmailed by the American president and his government. That's not what we were used to in the past.
I think Germany has a role to play to help, to be honest.
Yeah, but that's difficult for many of our foreign politician people to understand as we speak. But you're right. It's a major challenge for the years ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. And please keep in mind, there will be another Taiwan Salon next month organized by the Japanese Association of Taiwan Studies. And as soon as we get all the information on the usual channels, we, of course, will inform you about this. A fourth one will then be on culture. I think it will be more organized by Minya. But up to now, thanks again for the speakers. Thanks to Professor Xia, and see you soon. Have a nice day, a nice afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jens.